The air in the house was thick with the cloying scent of wilting lilies and cheap air freshener, a pathetic attempt to mask the lingering smell of sickness and grief. It had only been a week since Dad's funeral, a week since the earth had swallowed the last physical piece of him I had left. The silence he left behind was a gaping wound, but my siblings, Michael and Jessica, seemed determined to fill it with noise, with accusations. We were gathered in the study, a room paneled in dark cherry wood that had always smelled of old books and my father's pipe tobacco. Now it just smelled stale. The family lawyer, Mr. Henderson, a man whose face seemed permanently etched with an expression of weary disappointment, had just finished reading the will. It was simple, straightforward. Everything was to be split 3 ways, an equal share for each of us. For a fleeting moment, I felt a wave of gratitude for my father's fairness. It was his last attempt to force a peace he could never achieve in life. That peace lasted for approximately 90 seconds. "This is unacceptable," Michael declared, slamming a perfectly manicured fist on the mahogany desk. His suit was immaculate, a charcoal gray armor against the untidiness of genuine emotion. At 42, 2 years my senior, he had cultivated the look of a man who believed he was always the most important person in any room. An equal split. After everything I've done for this family, for his business. "He was your father, Michael. Not a business partner," I said softly, my voice hoarse from a week of unshed tears. Jessica, perched delicately on a leather armchair, shot me a look of pure venom. Her grief was performative, a series of theatrical sighs and dabs at her dry eyes with a silk handkerchief. "Oh, here we go. Saint Laura, dispensing her wisdom from on high. It's easy for you to talk about fairness. You never lifted a finger to help, you just swan in for the handout." The accusation stung, sharp and familiar. It was the narrative they had crafted for me my entire life. Laura, the black sheep, the artist, the one who had disappointed Dad by choosing a path that didn't involve spreadsheets or social climbing. They conveniently forgot the years I was his primary caregiver, the nights I spent reading to him when his eyes failed, the way I held his hand when the pain became too much. They saw what they wanted to see. "I'm not asking for a handout, Jessica," I said, keeping my voice even. "I'm accepting what our father wanted. What he wanted was for his legacy to be protected." Michael shot back, his face turning a blotchy red. "And that means putting the assets in capable hands. Not wasting a third of it on what? Your little pottery studio. Another trip to find yourself in some god-forsaken country." The cruelty was breathtaking. He knew my pottery studio was barely breaking even, a passion project I poured my heart and soul into. He knew I hadn't traveled in years, not since Dad's health began its slow, cruel decline. "This house alone," Michael continued, gesturing around the room with a sweeping proprietary air, "needs to be managed. We can't have it tied up with you." "What do you mean, tied up with me?" I asked, a cold dread beginning to seep into my bones. Jessica stood up, smoothing down her designer dress. "What Michael means, Laura, is that this is a family home, and you've made it very clear for a very long time that you don't want to be a part of this family. So we've decided, it's for the best." Mr. Henderson cleared his throat. "Now the will is quite clear. Each of you is a legal heir to the property." "We'll buy her out," Michael interrupted, waving a dismissive hand at the lawyer. He looked at me, his eyes cold and hard as river stones. "We'll give you a fair price for your third, you can take it and go. Be free, like you always wanted." The offer was an insult wrapped in a threat. They weren't asking, they were telling. This house wasn't just brick and mortar to me, it was the backdrop to every memory I held dear. It was the curve of the banister, my hand had slid down 1,000 times, the creak of the third stair on the way to my bedroom, the scent of roses from the garden Dad and I had planted together. It was the last piece of him. "I'm not selling," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "This is my home too." Jessica let out a short, ugly laugh. Your home? You haven't considered this your home in 20 years. You couldn't wait to run off to your bohemian little life. The only reason you're clinging to it now is because you smell money. You know we want to sell the business, and you think holding on to the house gives you leverage. That's not true. The injustice of it all finally cracked my composure. I was here. I was the one here with him at the end. Where were you, Jessica? On a cruise in the Bahamas. And you, Michael, closing a deal in Singapore. You flew in for the funeral like you were attending a board meeting. The truth hit them like a physical blow. Michael's jaw tightened, and a flicker of something shame perhaps, crossed Jessica's face before it was replaced by hardened fury. That's it, Michael said, his voice dangerously low. I've had enough of this. We are the ones who will maintain this family's name and assets. You are a liability. We are giving you an ultimatum, Laura. Accept our offer and leave, or you will get nothing. You can't do that, I whispered, looking to Mr. Henderson for support. He just sighed, adjusting his glasses. Legally, it would be complicated, he murmured, avoiding my gaze. Protracted, messy. We don't care, Michael said, his eyes locked on mine. We will drag this through the courts for years. We will prove you were estranged, that you exerted undue influence on him in his final days. We'll drain your third, and then some, in legal fees. By the time we're done, you'll walk away with nothing but debt. Or, you can walk away now, with a check in your hand. It was blackmail, pure and simple. They were using my love for our father against me, twisting my caregiving into a crime. I looked from Michael's smug, cruel face to Jessica's petulant pout, and in that moment, something inside me shifted. The grief was still there, a heavy cloak on my shoulders, but beneath it, a different feeling began to solidify. A cold, hard resolve. They thought they knew me. They thought I was the weak one, the emotional artist who would crumble under pressure. They had no idea who I had become in the quiet, lonely hours by my father's bedside. I stood up, my legs feeling surprisingly steady. I looked around the room, at the familiar books, the worn leather of Dad's chair, the faint stain on the carpet where I'd spilled grape juice when I was 6. I was letting the memory of it all sink in, branding it onto my soul. Fine, I said. The word hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Michael's expression relaxed into a triumphant smirk. Fine, you'll take the offer? No, I said, meeting his gaze directly. I won't take your offer. You want me to leave? Fine, I'll leave. You can have the house. Jessica gasped, her eyes wide with greedy delight. Michael looked stunned, then suspicious. Just like that? You're just walking away? What's the point in fighting? I asked, a weary sadness coloring my tone. It wasn't entirely an act. You're right, it would be messy. Dad wouldn't have wanted that. I turned to Mr. Henderson. You are my witness. I relinquish my claim on this property. They can have it. Laura, I advise you to think, Mr. Henderson began, but I cut him off. My mind is made up. I didn't give them a chance to react. I walked out of the study, my back straight, and went up the creaking stairs to my old bedroom. The room was just as I'd left it, a time capsule of my teenage angst and artistic dreams. I didn't pack much: a small box of photos, a stack of letters from Dad, a lopsided clay vase I'd made for him when I was 10. Things that had value only to me. As I carried my single box down the stairs, Michael and Jessica were standing in the foyer, whispering excitedly. They fell silent as I approached. They looked like vultures who had just secured a meal. You have 24 hours to get the rest of your junk out, Jessica said, unable to resist one last jab. I didn't answer. I walked to the heavy oak door, my hand resting on the cool brass knob for a final moment. I could feel their smug, victorious eyes on my back. They thought they had won. They thought they had banished the black sheep and secured their kingdom. As I stepped out into the crisp autumn air and pulled the door shut behind me, the sound of the latch clicking into place echoed like the cocking of a gun. They had no idea that the kingdom they were celebrating in was already mine. The fluorescent lights of the bank lobby, hummed with an irritating artificial buzz. It was a world away from the warm, sunlit chaos of my pottery studio, a place of cold marble, polished glass, and the quiet, crushing weight of numbers. It was 6 months before my father's death, and I was here because of a letter. A single terrifying piece of mail. I'd been visiting Dad, bringing him his favorite vegetable soup, when I'd stopped to pick up the mail from the mat. It was mostly junk, but one envelope stood out. It was thick, cream-colored, with a menacingly official logo in the corner, Sterling National Bank. It was addressed to him, but it was marked Final Notice in stark red letters. My father was a proud man. He had never spoken of financial trouble. He had always projected an aura of comfortable stability, the patriarch who provided. But pride is a fragile shield against debt. With a trembling hand, I had steamed the envelope open over the kettle, feeling like a spy in my own home. The words inside leaped off the page, cold and brutal. Foreclosure, auction, default. The numbers were staggering. My father, my strong, invincible father, had taken out a massive second mortgage on the house, years ago, a desperate attempt to prop up his struggling business after a series of bad investments. He had been drowning, and none of us knew. Michael was too busy building his own empire, Jessica too absorbed in her social calendar, and I was too busy just trying to keep his spirits up, focusing on his health, never thinking to ask about his finances. The guilt was a physical blow. He had been hiding it, shuffling payments, borrowing from Peter to pay Paul, until he couldn't anymore. The bank was done waiting. They were going to seize the house, our home, and sell it to the highest bidder in less than 2 months. That night, after I'd settled Dad into bed, I sat in the dark of the kitchen, the foreclosure notice laid out on the table like a death sentence. My first instinct was to run to Michael. He was the finance guy. He would know what to do, but I hesitated. I could already hear his response, the lectures, the I told you so's, the condescending assessment of Dad's failures. He would see it not as a family crisis to be solved with compassion, but as a mess to be cleaned up, an asset to be liquidated efficiently. He would argue to let the house go, to cut their losses. Jessica would agree. To them the house was an investment. To me it was a sanctuary. It was Dad's heart. I couldn't let that happen. I couldn't let his final years be marred by the humiliation of eviction, of seeing his life's work sold off on the courthouse steps. And I certainly couldn't let the home be lost forever to the whims of my siblings' greed. That night, I made a decision. It was terrifying, reckless, and possibly the most important thing I would ever do. I would save the house, myself. The next day I started making calls. My first stop was my own bank. My pottery studio, the one Michael so casually dismissed, had become modestly successful over the past few years. I hadn't taken lavish vacations or bought designer clothes. I had reinvested, saved, and lived simply. I had a decent nest egg, money I'd earmarked for a new kiln and a down payment on my own small place someday. It wasn't nearly enough to cover the mortgage debt, but it was a start. I sat across from a loan officer, a kind-faced woman named Mrs. Gable, and laid out my situation, carefully omitting the family drama. I explained that I wanted to purchase a specific property, to prevent it from going to public auction. I showed her my business records, my savings, my assets. She looked at the numbers, her brow furrowed in concentration. "This is a significant amount of money, Miss Martins," she said, her tone cautious. "To secure a loan of this size, you would essentially have to liquidate all your current investments and use your business as collateral. It's a very high-risk move." "I understand the risk," I said, my voice more confident than I felt, "but this property, it's not just an investment, it's important." She must have seen the desperation in my eyes. She spent the next hour walking me through options, crunching numbers, making calls. By the end of the meeting, we had a path forward. It was a narrow, perilous path. I would have to sell my stocks, drain my savings account, and sign a loan agreement that made my stomach clench with anxiety. I would be left with virtually nothing but this house and the business that was now leveraged against it. The next few weeks were a blur of paperwork and sleepless nights. I met with lawyers, corresponded with Sterling National Bank, through a third-party agent to keep my name out of it, and lived in a constant state of low-grade terror. I was terrified my father would find out. I was terrified Michael or Jessica would catch wind of what I was doing. Every phone call made my heart leap into my throat. I felt like I was leading a double life. During the day, I was Laura, the devoted daughter, bringing soup and reading the newspaper aloud. At night, I was Laura, the secret financier, poring over loan documents and property deeds. The day the sale was finalized, I was sitting in my car outside the lawyer's office, the signed papers on the passenger seat. It didn't feel real. Laura Martins, the irresponsible artist, the family disappointment, was now the legal owner of the Martins family mansion. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt a profound, bone-deep exhaustion, and a quiet, fierce sense of purpose. I had secured the fort. I had saved my father's home. He would live out his days in peace, never knowing how close he had come to losing everything. That was my only goal. His decline sped up after that. It was as if, on some subconscious level, he knew the crisis had been averted, and finally gave himself permission to let go. Those last months were precious and heartbreaking. We didn't talk about anything important like mortgages or wills. We talked about his childhood, about my mother, about the time I tried to bake a cake and filled the kitchen with smoke. We talked about everything and nothing. And when he finally passed, peacefully in his own bed, in his own home, a part of me felt a sense of relief, mixed with the overwhelming grief. I had kept my promise. Now, sitting in the cramped, beige-walled apartment I'd rented after my banishment, I felt a strange sense of detachment. I'd watch my siblings on social media. Jessica posted a picture of herself, smiling brightly, with the caption, "A new chapter. Cleansing the house of all the negative energy, #family first #positive vibes." Michael was more discreet, but a business acquaintance mentioned he was already talking to developers about the land value. They were moving so fast, so callously erasing every trace of Dad, of me. They were planning a party, a big one, a housewarming for a house they had lived in their whole lives. They were calling it a celebration of the family's future. The irony was so thick I could taste it. Every day, my resolve hardened. My initial plan had simply been to protect the house for my father. What came after, I hadn't thought about. But their cruelty, their utter lack of respect and love, had changed things. This was no longer just about protecting a legacy, it was about justice. They had kicked me out of my own house. They had accused me of being a greedy, opportunistic vulture. They were about to find out how wrong they were. I took the deed from its hiding place, a simple manila folder tucked away in my closet. The paper felt heavy, solid. It was my shield and my sword. I began to plan my return. It wouldn't be a dramatic, screaming confrontation. That was their style. Mine would be quiet, deliberate, and final. I booked an appointment with my hairdresser. I bought a new dress, a simple, elegant sheath of deep sapphire blue. I was preparing for battle, not with shouting, but with serenity. They were celebrating their victory. I was preparing to end the war. The night of the party was unseasonably warm for October. A heavy, humid air clung to the city, promising a storm that refused to break. It matched my mood perfectly. As I drove my modest sedan through the familiar tree-lined streets of the neighborhood, I felt a strange calm settle over me. The anxiety that had been my constant companion for months had evaporated, replaced by a crystalline certainty. I parked a block away from the house and walked the rest of the way, the sound of my heels clicking softly on the pavement. I could hear the party before I saw it. A thumping bass line pulsed through the night, a generic pop song that vibrated in my chest. Laughter, loud and brittle, spilled out from the open windows. They had certainly pulled out all the stops. Fairy lights were strung through the branches of the old oak tree in the front yard, the one Dad had almost cut down before I'd begged him to save it. The light cast a garish, festive glow on a scene that felt deeply profane. The front door was wide open. Guests spilled out onto the porch, clutching glasses of champagne, their faces flushed. No one paid me any mind as I walked up the stone path. To them, I was just another guest arriving late. I paused at the threshold, taking in the scene. The foyer was packed with people I barely recognized. Michael's business associates, Jessica's socialite friends, they were all beautiful, loud, and utterly superficial. They moved through my father's house like they owned it, their laughter echoing in the halls where my own childhood whispers still lingered. My siblings had redecorated. The warm, slightly worn furniture was gone, replaced by stark white and chrome pieces that looked like they belonged in a hotel lobby. Abstract art that meant nothing had replaced Dad's beloved landscape paintings. They hadn't just cleansed the house of my negative energies, they had sterilized it of all warmth, all memory, all love. A pang of anger, hot and sharp, pierced through my calm. I saw Jessica holding court near the new soulless fireplace. She was wearing a shimmering gold dress, laughing shrilly at something one of her friends said. Her eyes scanned the room, not with the grace of a host, but with the acquisitive gleam of a conqueror surveying her spoils. Then I saw Michael. He was standing by the bar, a glass of what was probably very expensive scotch in his hand, deep in conversation with a man in a tailored suit who had the unmistakable look of a property developer. They were pointing towards the back of the house, towards the garden, my garden. I could almost hear the words, lot size, zoning, potential. They were already carving up my father's ghost. That was it, that was the final push I needed. I took a deep breath, straightened my shoulders and stepped inside. I didn't have to walk far. The moment I entered the main living area, a ripple went through the crowd, conversations faltered, heads turned, the sea of strangers parted slightly, creating a pathway. It was as if my very presence had changed the atmospheric pressure in the room. The cheap pop music suddenly seemed intrusive and loud. Jessica was the first to spot me. Her smile froze, then melted into a mask of disbelief and fury. Her champagne flute tilted in her hand, spilling a little onto the pristine white rug. Laura, my name was a harsh whisper. What in God's name are you doing here? She strode towards me, her gold dress rustling, the prodigal sister who had dared to return to the feast she was barred from. Her approach drew Michael's attention. He turned, and his face went through a similar transformation from jovial confidence to cold, hard rage. I didn't think we could be any clearer, Michael said, his voice a low growl as he came to stand beside Jessica, forming a united hostile front. You are not welcome here. I looked from his face to hers, at the undisguised hatred in their eyes. I offered them a small, serene smile. That's a funny thing to say, Michael, I said, my voice clear and steady, easily carrying over the sudden hush that had fallen over the nearby guests. Seeing as I'm the host, a few people gasped. Jessica's face contorted. Host, have you lost your mind? You're trespassing. I'm calling the police. She fumbled for the phone in her tiny, glittering purse. I wouldn't do that if I were you, I advised gently. It would be terribly embarrassing for you when they arrive, and I show them my paperwork. Michael's eyes narrowed. He was smarter than Jessica. He understood that I wouldn't be here, wouldn't be this calm if I didn't have an ace up my sleeve, but his arrogance wouldn't let him believe it. What paperwork? He scoffed, trying to regain control. The will. Mr. Henderson witnessed you relinquish your claim. You have nothing. Oh, I have something, I said, my gaze sweeping over the silent, staring guests. I raised my voice slightly, ensuring everyone could hear. I have the deed. I have the title. I have the bank statements, and the signed purchase agreement. You see, you're right. You did kick me out of the family home. What you didn't realize is that when you did it, you were kicking me out of my home. The silence in the room was now absolute. The only sound was the faint, tinny beat of the forgotten pop song. Michael stared at me, his mind clearly racing, trying to process my words. The developer he had been speaking with took a subtle step away from him. You're lying, Jessica hissed, her voice trembling. You're a pathetic, desperate liar. Am I? I reached into my purse and pulled out a crisp, folded document. It was a copy of the deed. I didn't offer it to them. I just held it in my hand. 6 months ago, I discovered this house was in foreclosure. Dad was about to lose everything. So I used every penny I had, took out a loan that I will be paying off for the next 30 years, and I bought it, anonymously. To protect him, to give him peace in his final days. I let my eyes rest on Michael, then Jessica. I wanted them to feel the full weight of it. You talk about protecting his legacy. You accused me of being a gold digger, but while you were busy planning your cruises and closing your deals, this family's legacy was about to be sold on the courthouse steps. The only thing that stopped it was the black sheep. The daughter who supposedly didn't care. Michael's face was ashen. He looked like he'd been punched in the gut. He finally understood. He knew I wasn't lying. The facts, the timeline. It all made a horrifying kind of sense to him. You can't have. He stammered, his voice losing all its bluster. But I did, I said softly. I looked around the room, at the garish decorations, the pretentious guests, the monument they had built to their own greed. And I have to say, I don't much care for what you've done with the place. The storm that had been brewing outside finally broke. A brilliant flash of lightning lit up the room, followed by a deafening crack of thunder. It was a perfectly timed dramatic effect. The party was over. The thunderclap acted like a starter pistol. The hushed, frozen tableau of the party shattered into a flurry of motion and panicked whispers. Guests who, moments before, had been laughing and drinking with my siblings, now avoided their eyes, suddenly finding the patterns on the rug fascinating or remembering urgent appointments elsewhere. They began to melt away, murmuring awkward goodbyes, eager to flee the epicenter of a family implosion. They had come for a party, not a public execution. Michael stood rooted to the spot, the color completely drained from his face. The developer he'd been schmoozing with gave him a curt, dismissive nod, and was one of the first out the door. All of Michael's power, his carefully constructed persona of success and control, had evaporated in an instant. He was just a man standing in a house that wasn't his, exposed as a fool. Jessica, however, reacted with characteristic drama. "No, I don't believe you," she shrieked, her voice cracking. "This is our house. Dad would never. You tricked him. You forged those papers." She lunged for the document in my hand, her manicured nails like claws. I didn't flinch, I simply sidestepped her clumsy attack, holding the deed out of her reach. "It has nothing to do with Dad's will, Jessica," I said, my voice cutting through her hysterics. "This is a simple property transaction. It's all legally filed with the county clerk's office. You can look it up yourself, if you like. The property at 112 Oakwood Drive was sold 3 months ago to a private holding company." I paused, letting the final piece fall into place. "A holding company of which I am the sole proprietor." Mr. Henderson, who had been invited to the party as a social formality, pushed his way through the last of the departing guests. He looked exhausted, as if he had aged 10 years in the last 10 minutes. "Laura, is this true?" he asked, his eyes wide with disbelief. I nodded and handed him the copy of the deed. He took it, his hands trembling slightly as he unfolded it. He read it, then read it again. He looked up at me, then at Michael and Jessica. The lawyer in him took over, and his expression settled into one of grim finality. "The document appears to be perfectly legal and valid," he announced to the nearly empty room. He looked at Michael. "She owns the house, Michael, outright." That was the final nail. Jessica let out a choked sob and sank onto one of the sterile white couches, her gold dress looking cheap and tawdry with the harsh light. Michael just stared at me, his mind grappling with the sheer scale of his miscalculation. "Why?" he finally whispered, the single word full of confusion and defeat. "Why wouldn't you say anything? When we told you to leave, why did you just go?" "Because I wanted you to show me who you really were," I said, and for the first time, a note of my own long-buried anger surfaced. "And you did. You couldn't wait to get rid of me. You desecrated this house, planned to sell it off piece by piece, all while congratulating yourselves on your family-first values. You didn't just want me gone, you wanted to humiliate me. You wanted me to leave with nothing, branded as a failure, and a leech. I took a step closer, my voice dropping. I left because I knew Dad wouldn't have wanted a fight. I left to honor his memory, but my silence wasn't weakness, it was observation. I gave you every chance to be decent, to be kind, to show an ounce of the respect Dad deserved. You failed, miserably. I looked from his shattered expression to Jessica's weeping form. There was no triumph in me, only a vast, aching sadness. This was my family, this was all that was left. I'm not like you, I said, the words heavy with the truth. I'm not going to throw you out on the street with 24 hours notice. That's your move, not mine. A flicker of hope appeared in Michael's eyes. So, what happens now? Now, I said, taking a deep breath and feeling the solid ground of my own home beneath my feet. You will pack your things. You will find another place to live. I will give you 30 days. 30 days to vacate the premises. You can consider it a generous severance package. 30 days. Jessica wailed from the couch. Where are we supposed to go in 30 days? I'm sure you'll figure something out, I replied without sympathy. You're both very resourceful when it comes to getting what you want. I walked past them into the center of the room. I ran my hand along the cold metal frame of a modern sculpture they had installed. It was ugly and meaningless. I thought of the worn wooden chess table Dad and I used to play on that had stood in its place. You will leave the house in the condition you found it, I continued, my voice now holding the unmistakable tone of command. Which means all of this stuff goes with you. I want it empty. I want it back to the way it was. Michael finally found his voice again, laced with a desperate, pathetic attempt at negotiation. Laura, listen, we can work something out, a partnership. We can manage the property for you. I turned to face him, and the look in my eyes must have been enough to silence him for good. The time for partnerships is over, Michael. The time for family as we knew it is over. You made that choice in Dad's study a month ago. These are the consequences. I left them there, standing amidst the wreckage of their party and their arrogance. I walked through the house, my house, room by room. The lingering smell of strange perfume and champagne couldn't completely erase the deeper, more familiar sense of home. I went to the back door and looked out into the garden. The rain had stopped, and the air was clean and fresh. The moon was breaking through the clouds, casting a silvery light on the rose bushes Dad and I had so carefully tended. This wasn't a victory. It didn't feel like one. It felt like a necessary amputation. I had cut away the diseased parts of my life to save what was most precious. It was a painful, heartbreaking procedure, but it was done. Alone in the quiet, I pulled out my phone and looked at the last picture I had taken of Dad. We were in the garden, and he was smiling, his face tired but content. I had done it. I had saved his home. It had cost me my family, my financial security, and a piece of my heart, but I had saved his home. And as I stood there, in the silent, empty house, I knew my own new chapter was finally, truly beginning. It would be a quiet chapter, a peaceful one, a chapter written on my own terms, in my own home.